The weapon in the knight captain's hand dissolved the instant it touched the paper. Not melted, not broken, gone. The way a candle flame dies in wind, there one breath and absent the next. The man who had led an army of trained killers into a noble house stood holding an empty fist, and for a moment, not one of his soldiers moved. That was how Arsenadell survived the first night. With a blank piece of paper, a dead man's sword, and a trade no one in that room understood. But to understand any of it, you have to go back 3 days. To the moment a novelist opened his eyes in a body that was not his own, inside a story he had written himself, with the sound of boots on gravel growing louder outside the window. His name, in the life he remembered, was Nam Wu Hyan, a writer, unremarkable by most measures, the kind of man who kept odd hours and let his tea go cold, who had spent years building a world of demons and half-bloods and ruthless academies on the page. He knew every secret of that world, every trap, every death, including this one. The body he had landed in was Arsenadell, called Adele by those few who bothered with kindness, a half-demon noble, the last remnant of the Arsen family, a bloodline that had once held real power in the human empire, before 6 of the greatest human houses decided that mixed blood was an offense that needed correcting. They had stripped the Arsen family of its title, scattered its people, and left the heir to this house to die in it. Not in open combat, not with any dignity. The plan was a quiet execution, dressed up as a border enforcement action, so that no one would need to feel bad about it afterward. Wu Hyan knew all of this because he had written it. He had sat at a desk in a world without magic and built this tragedy from nothing, and he had never once hesitated over what happened to Adele in Chapter 1. Now he was Adele, lying on a cold floor, in a body that had spent years confined indoors, with mana he could not access and knights arriving at the gate. The irony did not escape him. He had authored this suffering. Every cruel twist, every stacked against him detail of Adele's life, the isolation, the weakened constitution, the enemies closing in, Wu Hyan had designed all of it. And now the story was going to happen to him, unless he found a way to rewrite the ending in real time. He sat up. The room was dim and smelled of dust. His hands, Adele's hands, were pale and faintly trembling. He had maybe 2 days before the knights reached the door. The one thing he found in his immediate search of the room was a piece of paper, blank, plain, sitting on the writing desk like it had always been there. Something pulled at him when he touched it, a faint pressure, not quite a sound. He turned it over, nothing on either side. He set it down and thought. In the story, Adele had died before he could use anything. But Wu Hyan knew that somewhere in this house, in the deeper history of the Arsen family, there were resources the original character never got to reach. And somewhere inside this body, displaced but not gone, was the original Adele's soul. He picked up the paper again. He wrote a single question on it. The ink disappeared as it touched the surface. Silence. Then a faint resistance in the paper, like pressing a thumb against a drumhead. Words formed in response. Not ink, but an impression, as if pressed in from the other side. The original Adele was still here. Not fully present, not alive in any real sense, but coherent enough to answer. And whatever remained of him was not sentimental about it. He named his price immediately. Information cost gold. Skills cost more. Emergency power would cost things Wu Hyan didn't fully understand yet. Priced in debts he would have to settle later. Wu Hyan paid. The first thing he bought was mana control, the basic foundation that let him access the power sitting locked in Adele's body. It arrived not as a lesson but as knowledge downloaded directly into muscle and reflex, and the sensation was violent enough that he bit through his lip. He sat still until the shaking passed. The second thing he bought was an understanding of 3 specific abilities. Darkness, which let the user blind opponents through all 5 senses and convert shadow into something that could cut. Killing intent, a pure aura of threat that could freeze a person's body if their will was not strong enough to push through it. And position transfer, which let the user swap their location with any object or person within a set radius. Position transfer was the one that mattered right now. It cost the most. Wu Hyan paid anyway. He had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan, but it was the only one that made use of what he had. No combat experience, a body that tired quickly, a radius of maybe 20 meters, and complete foreknowledge of how knights like these tended to think. He spent the remaining hours memorizing the house's layout and waiting. The knights arrived at dawn on the second day. There were more than Wu Hyan had expected. A full company, not just a small escort. Captain Feltz led them in personally, which told Wu Hyan everything about how seriously the 6 great houses were taking this. They had not sent a messenger, they had not sent an official notice, they had sent a man in armor with orders to leave no body to complain about. Feltz was large, not in the exaggerated sense of a story's final boss, but in the practical sense of a man who had been in real fights and had always walked away from them. He carried his sword loose at his side, the habit of someone who had drawn it so many times the weight was unconscious. He moved through the house with the calm of a professional, checking rooms, posting soldiers at exits. Wu Hyan let himself be found. He was sitting in the main hall when Feltz walked in, and he could see the captain assess him in a single glance. The pale skin, the slight frame, the complete absence of any fighting posture, and decide this would take no time at all. What Feltz could not see was the blank paper in Wu Hyan's sleeve, and what he could not know was that the item Wu Hyan needed him to bring close was already in his hand. The conversation was brief. Feltz delivered the formal notice of execution, which was standard. It gave the action a veneer of legal weight. Wu Hyan listened without moving. He asked one question. He asked Feltz to confirm the order and to put it in writing, and when Feltz said there was no writing required, Wu Hyan said that was unfortunate. He pulled out the paper, he pressed it flat against the table in front of him, and then he waited. Feltz was not a foolish man. He hesitated, but he was a man who had done this kind of work for a long time and had never once had a target do something he couldn't predict. So after a moment he crossed the room, leaned forward, and pressed his sword hand against the table to brace himself as he looked at the paper. The blade touched the edge of the sheet. It vanished. Not the sword was too large. What vanished was everything inside the blade's effective radius that the paper could consume. The mana stored in the weapon's core, the enchantments woven into its steel over years of use, the shaped intent that made it more than a piece of metal. The paper aided in one pull, and the sword in Feltz's hand became a dead weight, still physically intact, still sharp in the way any well-made blade was sharp, but emptied of everything that made it a knight captain's weapon. Feltz pulled back. He looked at what was in his hand. He looked at Wu Hyan. Wu Hyan used position transfer. He didn't swap with the captain. He swapped with one of the support pillars 20 feet to Feltz's left, and he did it 3 times in under 4 seconds, each time choosing a new position before the soldiers could calibrate to the last one. Not fighting. Repositioning. Staying out of reach while the room collapsed into confusion. What followed was not elegant. It was fast and it was ugly, and it cost Wu Hyan more mana than he wanted to spend, but he had prepared for that. He had prepared for the fact that killing intent, released without filter, would lock the bodies of men who were not trained to resist it. Feltz resisted. Of course he did. A man like that would. But the soldiers around him dropped to their knees one after another, and the ones who stayed on their feet were too disoriented by the swapping to close the distance in time. He did not kill Feltz. He thought about it. He stood close enough, for one moment, that he could have. But Feltz alive and humiliated was more useful than Feltz dead, because the 6 great houses needed to know something had gone wrong here, and the form that news took would shape what happened next. He left Feltz in the hall with his empty sword and his injured pride and no good explanation for his commanders. He walked out the back of the house, through a passage in the arson estate that he knew existed because he had written it into the story himself, and he followed the path through the forest behind the estate toward a demonic gate that should not have been on any official map of the region. It was there, exactly where he had put it. He stepped through. The demonic realm was not what travelers' accounts from the human side described it as. Those accounts tended toward fire and ruin, dramatic details from people who had either never been there or had been there badly. What Wu Hyan stepped into was a forest, dense and cold, with a different quality of light than the human world. Not darker exactly, but heavier, as if the air itself had more weight per breath. He had no guide, he had no allies, he had the blank paper, a body that was already exhausted, and a destination in mind. In the story he had written, the region beyond this gate contained a testing ground, a dungeon of sorts, man-made in origin, built by one of the old Arson ancestors as a proving mechanism for the family's heirs. The original Adele had died without knowing it existed. Wu Hyan knew because he had designed it, had worked out its traps and guardians in a planning document before writing the relevant chapters. He found the entrance in less than an hour. From the outside, it looked like a collapsed section of hillside. Up close, there was a door. Inside was what he expected and also worse. Because knowing something is dangerous in an abstract creative sense and standing in front of it as an exhausted half-demon with limited mana are two different experiences. The first chamber held a monster of the kind that the story categorized as a threshold guardian. Not the largest creature in the demonic bestiary, but one engineered specifically to test the spatial instincts of an arson heir. It moved between walls. It used the room's angles. Against someone who could not read where it was about to appear, it would be lethal within 30 seconds. Wu Hyan was not fast enough to fight it. He was, however, fast enough to swap. He placed himself at one wall and a stone from the floor at another, and when the creature committed to an angle, he swapped again. Not himself this time, but the stone and the door's inner lock. The creature lunged into a barrier it hadn't expected, rebounded, and Wu Hyan took the half-second of disorientation to swap it with a support beam in the ceiling. The beam was fixed in place. The creature was now where the beam had been, which was to say, wedged into a structural joint 12 feet off the ground, with no leverage and no room to move. He left it there and moved deeper. The second chamber was worse. The third was manageable if he didn't breathe through his mouth. By the time he reached the final room, he was running on the last threads of what his mana pool could sustain, and his hands had the fine tremor of someone who had been pushing a depleted system past its warnings. The final room held a case. Inside the case, preserved in something that was neither glass nor water, but had properties of both, was a pair of eyes. Not attached to a body, just the eyes, intact, centuries old, belonging to an ancestor who had possessed a trait called the Eye of Superbia, a bloodline ocular ability that enhanced dynamic vision and let the user read the fine movements of muscle and tendon in anyone they faced. He took them. The process of acquiring them was not something he would have written in detail in the original story, and standing in that room, he was grateful he hadn't, because some details were better left unrecorded. He walked out of the dungeon with a new ocular ability, a mana pool that needed 2 days of rest to recover, and absolutely no plan for what came next. What came next found him. Her name was Renee. She was the daughter of Kree, who was the patriarch of the Bear family, one of the great demonic houses, aligned with the sin of pride, and she was standing in the forest outside the dungeon's exit, with a sword at her side and the patient stillness of someone who had been waiting for a while and did not consider waiting to be any particular inconvenience. She asked who he was. He answered with something close enough to the truth that it held up. He was of the Arson bloodline. He had come to retrieve what was his family's. She looked at him for a long moment, in the way people look at someone when they are weighing something they haven't said yet. Then she asked if he was the guard her father had assigned to her. He had no idea what she was talking about. In the story, this encounter had gone differently, and the particular misunderstanding she was operating under had not existed in his notes. He thought fast. He said yes. It was a mistake he would spend weeks managing, and also, in ways he could not have predicted, something else entirely. Renee led him to her father's estate. Kree received them in a hall the size of a small fortress, a man so large and quiet that the silence around him felt structural. He listened to Wu Hyan's account of the dungeon with the expression of someone reviewing a document rather than hearing a story. At the end, he nodded once. Then he offered Wu Hyan the Bear family's demon god cultivation technique. This was worth more than anything Wu Hyan had taken from the dungeon. The cultivation technique was a framework for gathering mana at a speed most practitioners spent careers trying to approximate through other means. It also came with a condition. Kree embedded a poison worm in Wu Hyan's body before handing over the technique, a standard measure of insurance against betrayal. The worm would kill him if he defected, or if Kree gave the word. Wu Hyan accepted. He spent that night learning to feel the worm inside him, not its presence, which was subtle, but its location, and the boundary between living tissue and the inanimate parasite. By morning, he had a theory. By the following afternoon, using position transfer applied with extreme precision to the smallest possible radius, he had tested it. The worm was now sitting on the floor of his room, inert, looking like nothing in particular. His body was clean. Kree, checking the worm's status through whatever remote mechanism he had established, would find it responding normally. because the worm was still alive, just no longer inside anyone. He stayed at the estate. He trained. The cultivation technique accelerated his mana recovery in ways that made the first few days feel like learning to breathe correctly after a lifetime of shallow breaths. More than that, the practice drew attention from somewhere else. The god of pride was not something Wu Hyan had fully rendered on the page. He had given the deity a name, a general role in the demonic hierarchy, and a few appearances in the story's later arcs. He had not spent much time on the god's personality, because gods in the story were mostly set pieces. He revised that assessment when the god made contact. The awareness arrived during a deep session of the cultivation technique. Not a vision exactly, more a presence. Something very old, examining him with the particular interest of an entity that had been watching the Arsen bloodline for longer than the Arsen family had been recording its history. The god felt, in some indescribable way, a resonance, a kinship that defied the normal channels of divine favor. He marked Wu Hyan, a physical impression, inscribed somewhere that would not show in casual inspection, but would be legible to anything that looked closely enough. It was not an alliance, it was not protection, it was an acknowledgement. You are connected to something I recognize, and I am choosing to note that. Wu Hyan was not certain what it meant. He tucked it away as a resource whose full value he hadn't determined yet. Days passed. He and Renee began to operate as a unit, partly because the Bear estate expected it, and partly because Renee was genuinely useful. She carried a sword the way the cultivation techniques theory described ideal practitioners: clean, economical, without waste. She did not fight for display. She fought to finish things. He was not sure when she stopped treating him with the polite distance of a professional assignment and started treating him with the faint, irritated attention of someone who had noticed him. He noticed the shift the same way you notice that a season has changed, not during it, but after. The ring was an accident. In the domain of the undead, a region northeast of the estate that Kree wanted cleared, they found it in the ruins of a structure that had been old before either of them was born. A silver band, set with a stone that held light like a held breath. Wu Hyan knew what it was. The eternal full moon ring was a demonic artifact, and in demonic tradition, placing it on another person's finger was the same as a formal marriage declaration. He had planned to take it for its mana properties and catalog it as a resource. He handed it to Renee to examine. She turned it over, looked at the inscription on the inner face, and told him he understood what this meant, correct? Her voice was entirely flat, which was the tone she used when she was most unnerved. He said he had not read the inscription clearly. She looked at him for a very long time. They cleared the domain of the undead. They did not discuss the ring again. She wore it. The class monitor meeting was held in Lucian's office, which looked less like an administrative space and more like a room that had been designed to make everyone inside it aware of their own smallness. The ceiling was high enough that the upper portion disappeared into shadow. The desk was positioned so that Lucian sat with his back to the only window, which meant anyone facing him was facing the light. These were not accidental choices. The 8 class representatives filed in and stood. Lucian did not ask them to sit, because there were no chairs on their side of the desk. He laid out the midterm assignment without preamble. Each class would be given an operational target appropriate to their evaluation level. Class B would hit a supply route. Class C would clear a contested demonic settlement. Class D would run a border observation exercise. Class A would intercept a delegation from the Imperial Academy operating in a classified domain on the human realm's side of the border. He said intercept. The word was doing a particular kind of work. Wu Hyan processed this while keeping his expression neutral. In the story, this assignment had gone badly in ways that he had designed to test his characters, to push them past what they thought they could handle and reveal what was underneath. He had written the human side's response as overwhelming, a force calibrated not for the students who were supposed to be there, but for whoever the Empire's intelligence had said would be there, which was to say, a force calibrated for an adult raiding party. The information the Empire had received had been wrong, but the response they had prepared was not scaled to wrong information. It was scaled to maximum deterrence, because that was how Imperial military doctrine operated. When uncertain about the threat, assume the higher end and resource accordingly. He had written this. He had thought it was dramatically effective. Standing in Lucian's office, he revised his opinion of dramatic effectiveness. He said nothing during the meeting. He noted the other representatives' reactions, who looked confident, who looked calculating, who looked afraid and was managing it well. who looked afraid and was not managing it at all. The information was useful. Not for this mission, necessarily. For the longer accounting of who in this institution was going to matter. They were dismissed. He walked back to the Class A dormitory wing and spent the evening doing what he had been doing most evenings. Cultivating, reviewing, and building out contingency architecture in his head for every scenario the mission could produce. He could not prevent what was coming. He did not have the mana to rewrite the engagement entirely. What he could do was move through it with more information than anyone else had, and make sure that the people worth keeping alive stayed alive. Some of them, anyway. The secret domain on the human realms side was accessed through a gate that Lucian provided coordinates for, and Class A was expected to navigate without further assistance. The domain itself was a pocket dimension, man-made in the way that high-circle mages made things, with enormous resource expenditure and a resulting structure that was technically impressive and humanly sterile. Flat light, regular angles, the kind of space that had been optimized for function and had nothing left over for anything else. Class A entered in their assigned formation. Wu Hyan had the class representative position, which in IDEA's organizational structure meant tactical coordination authority. He was expected to give directions, and the expectation carried enough institutional weight that most of the class would follow directions given, regardless of whether they personally found him credible. He used this. He split the group into operational pairs based on complementary abilities, assigned zones, and designated rally points at 200-meter intervals. He gave Samuel, the gluttony heir, broad-shouldered and still operating with the controlled hostility of someone who had agreed to functional cooperation without completing his feelings about it, the forward position, because Samuel's devouring ability made him the most effective at absorbing unexpected contact. Then he separated from the group. Not in the way that would register as a tactical decision. In the way that someone follows a branch route for what looks like a reconnaissance purpose, gradually extending the distance between himself and the main body until the main body was far enough away that his true direction was not visible to any of them. He had a specific target. Instructor Besaha, a fifth circle mage, human, assigned as the Academy delegation's security anchor. In the original story, Besaha had been a recurring antagonist, the kind of technically formidable practitioner whose arrogance about his own defensive capability was structural. He had built 10 layers of mana shield around himself at all times as a matter of habit, which meant he felt safe in situations where he should not have felt safe, because no one had ever breached all 10 layers. Wu Hyan found him in the domain's eastern sector, running what appeared to be a survey exercise with 3 student observers. He gave Besaha 45 seconds to establish a false sense of normalcy, watching from a position that the Eye of Superbia let him maintain without visible light, reading the patterns of Besaha's mana output and identifying the specific rhythm at which the shield layers refreshed. Shields refreshed from inside out. The outer layers were always newest. The inner layers, the ones closest to the body, were oldest. They had been up longest, they refreshed last, and in the fraction of a second when the innermost layer was cycling, there was a gap. He had one shot at it. Possibly 1.5, if he was fast. He moved through shadow, darkness carrying him along the domain's floor like something that was more absence than presence, and closed the distance in 4 seconds. He pushed chaos mana into the point of his blade, the gray light of it reacting against Besaha's structured layered shields in the specific way that chaos reacted against ordered systems, not forcefully, but incorrectly, slipping through the gaps between layers the way water finds faults in stone. He breached the 9th layer on the first pass, the 10th on the second, the innermost on the third, which was a fraction of a second after Besaha had turned and was processing that something was wrong, but had not yet translated that processing into defensive action. The delegation's security anchor had spent 20 years behind 10 layers of mana shield. He had not considered, with adequate seriousness, what he would do if the shield was no longer there. Wu Hyan completed the assignment and moved immediately. No pause, no assessment, forward into the domain's interior, because the 3 student observers had seen something and the domain's alert structure was now active, and he had approximately 4 minutes before the human side's response arrived in a form that would make the last several minutes look like preparation. He used those 4 minutes to find a homunculus, a constructed biological entity used by the delegation for courier functions, and feed it to the snakeworm he had been carrying since the dungeon clearance. The worm consumed it with the specific efficiency of a parasite that had been patient for a long time. The homunculus carried an elixir as part of its courier function, a concentrated mana supplement that had been intended for the delegation's senior mage. Wu Hyan recovered it from what remained of the homunculus, assessed it in about 3 seconds, and drank it. His mana ceiling moved. Not gradually, sharply, the way a blocked pipe clears. A sudden pressure release, his capacity expanding past a threshold he had been approaching through cultivation for weeks and had not yet crossed. 2,000. Past 2,000. He stopped counting and kept moving. He found Class A 40 seconds later, and found Class A in the situation he had designed and spent weeks quietly dreading. Fias was not in the story's original assignment. That was the thing Wu Hyan had to work with, the variable he had not authored. The human empire's intelligence had over-resourced the response, which meant they had sent something that should not have been here. A warrior in the upper tier of human combat capability, carrying an ice hammer that was not a metaphorical ice hammer but a physical weapon, with a mana core that produced cold on contact at levels that made engagement with it a medical emergency rather than a tactical problem. He had found Class A because Fias had found Class A first. Samuel was on the ground, not unconscious. Samuel was too stubborn for unconscious, but damaged in ways that were not minor. His left arm had been frozen at the elbow joint and then struck, which had the specific structural result that freezing and striking always had. His right leg was gone below the knee. He was upright on what remained, using his root ability, a gluttony-affiliated power that let him extend biological tendrils from his own body and consume what they touched, to hold himself in place against a wall, because without that, he would not be upright at all. Fias stood in the center of the engagement space with the unhurried quality of someone who was not concerned about what came next. He was large in the way Feltz had been large, but where Feltz had been the size of a professional fighter, Fias was the size of a professional fighter who had then continued. His hammer rested on his shoulder. He had not been trying, the demonstration of that was Samuel. The rest of Class A had pulled back to a perimeter distance that was honest about what they could contribute to this engagement. Wu Hyan stepped forward. He could hear himself making the tactical assessment in the same part of his mind that had always written these scenes, the part that calculated costs and outcomes and narrative weight. The assessment was not good. His current mana pool, past 2,000 but not well past it, was not adequate for a sustained engagement with a practitioner at Fias's level. Position transfer at his current range would not create enough displacement to be decisive against someone with Fias's reaction time. Darkness would work once, maybe, before Fias adjusted his sensory strategy. He needed more than he had. He took out the blank paper. He had used it for trades before. Skills, information, identification. He had never asked it for what he was about to ask it for. Partly because the price was unknown, and partly because the original Adele's soul had always been clear that certain exchanges operated on a different level than the ones they had conducted so far. He wrote, "I need to borrow your strength." The paper was still for longer than he had ever seen it be still. Then the response came, and it did not name a price. It asked a question. It asked if he understood that what he was borrowing was not a skill or a technique or a stored resource. It was the original Adele's actual power, filtered through a meeting point between their shared body and whatever the paper contained. It asked if he understood that this would require a reckoning. He wrote, yes. The world went sideways. Not physically, he was still standing, still in the domain's interior, still 6 meters from Fias, who was watching him with the mild curiosity of someone who did not yet understand what was happening. What went sideways was internal. Something opened in the space between his understanding of this body and the body itself. A void, gray-lit. The specific gray of his chaos attribute but saturated. Everything else stripped away, and standing in that void was a reflection, not a mirror image, a presence. The original Arsenadell, assembled from whatever remained of him in the paper and the body's residual memory, tall where Wu Hyan was slight, present in a way that was dense and cold and very, very old for someone who had died young. He looked at Wu Hyan with eyes that held no warmth and no hostility, only assessment. He extended 20%. It arrived like a tide. Wu Hyan's mana reading did not climb gradually. It jumped, from past 2,000 to past 4,000, in the time it took for his nervous system to register the change and stop resisting it. His posture changed without him deciding to change it. His hands steadied. The slight chronic tremor that had been present since the dungeon clearance, The artifact of mana exhaustion that had never fully resolved was gone. Fias, who had been watching all of this with increasing attention, shifted his grip on the hammer. Wu Hyan moved. He did not use position transfer, because position transfer at this mana density was different from position transfer at his normal operating level. Richer, more responsive, the radius expanded and the exchange speed faster than he had calibrated for. He had to adjust mid-movement, which he did, because the Eye of Superbia was feeding him information at a rate he could now actually process, rather than partially process. He crossed the distance between them in a way that was not a charge and was not a dodge and was not quite either. A diagonal approach that used two position exchanges in sequence to arrive at an angle Fias had not prepared for, because the angle did not exist in any standard approach geometry. The first exchange of blows was honest about what it was. Fias was stronger, by a significant margin, and the Ice Hammer's mana output on contact was designed to shut down the circulatory systems of whatever it touched. Wu Hyan did not let it touch him squarely. He used position transfer to swap with his own shadow at the moment of impact, which was technically a thing he was doing for the first time, and which succeeded in a way that was partly skill and partly the borrowed mana making his spatial instincts unusually precise. He pushed darkness at Fias, targeted, and used the moment of sensory disruption to get the snake worm close enough to do its work. Not a bite, a graze, the worm's exterior against the skin of Fias's forearm, enough contact for the toxin to transfer. The worm retreated immediately, back into the concealed space Wu Hyan had been keeping it in since the dungeon. The toxin was not fast, that was the thing about it. It was designed for delay, for a slow working that would not manifest until the target was somewhere they considered safe. Because the original purpose had been exactly this, to wound someone in a way they did not understand until too late. Fias did not know he had been bitten. He knew the engagement had become more complicated than anticipated, because the half-demon student who should not have been a problem was now moving at a speed and mana density that changed the calculation. He made a professional decision, the decision that professionals make when the cost-benefit of continuing exceeds the objective's value, and disengaged, not fleeing, withdrawing. There was a difference, and Fias maintained it with the discipline of someone for whom professional form was not separate from professional pride. He stepped back to a distance that made re-engagement his choice, looked at Wu Hyan across that distance, and then moved toward the domain's exit. Class A let him go. No one had the mana or the confidence to stop him, and Wu Hyan did not try, because the snake worm had already done what needed doing. The borrowed power receded. It did not leave all at once. It stepped back in increments, the tide going out, his mana reading dropping back through 4,000 toward 2,000, and settling somewhere between the two, slightly higher than his pre-borrowing baseline, in a way that might be permanent or might be the system still equalizing. He did not know yet. He knew one thing that had a cost attached to it. The original Adele's reflection had given him 20%, and had asked for a reckoning, and had not specified what form the reckoning would take. He had said yes without knowing. He had made a deal with the original owner of the body he was living in, and the terms were open. He filed this in the same accounting category as everything else. Samuel was still upright against the wall when Wu Hyan crossed to him. Upright through the root tendrils, which were now doing structural work for a body that had lost more than a body was designed to lose in a single engagement. His remaining hand was pressed flat against the wall behind him, and his face had the particular quality of someone who is maintaining consciousness by choosing to, rather than by biological default. He looked at Wu Hyan, he said, with a precision that cost him something to produce, that his root ability could do what was necessary, that there was a version of this where he survived, that the version required Wu Hyan's cooperation. Wu Hyan understood what he was describing before he finished. The root ability's consumption function was not limited to external targets. Samuel had always been able to turn it inward, and the logical extension of an ability that consumed and dissolved and converted was that it could dissolve Samuel's own remaining body into something that could attach to a living host and persist indefinitely. Not live, exactly. Persist. There was a difference. Samuel did not ask permission in any emotional sense. He stated what was going to happen and waited to see if Wu Hyan would step back. Wu Hyan stayed where he was. The process was fast and was not something he would describe in detail, because some things that are technically interesting are also best processed afterward, from a distance. What it produced was a weight on his right hand that had not been there before. A horn, or something that functioned as a horn, grafted at the base of his fourth finger by root tendrils that had incorporated themselves into his flesh, while his mana density was still elevated from the borrowed power. Samuel's voice, when it arrived, came from approximately where the horn was, quieter than his normal register, drier in tone, as if the experience had compressed his range. He said that this was significantly less pleasant than he had expected. Wu Hyan said he had not expected it to be pleasant. Samuel said that was a reasonable position. They stood there for a moment in the hollow of the domain, surrounded by a class that was managing its reaction to the last 20 minutes with varying degrees of success, and reached the unspoken agreement that whatever their prior relationship had been was now something categorically different, and they would work out what that meant in subsequent conversations. Getting Class A out of the domain was the final operational problem, and it arrived in the form of an archer. Sisela was the Imperial Academy's long-range specialist, a student council operative who functioned at instructor-level capability in a very specific domain. She could place a shot at 5 kilometers with a precision that rendered the distance meaningless. Wu Hyan knew she was there because of the sequence: a whistle that was not wind, a displacement in the air that his elevated mana sensitivity read as incoming at a speed that precluded reaction through normal means. He used position transfer, not individual swaps. He used the level 2 function, the ability to swap 2 external targets with each other, not involving himself, and he used it across the full extent of the group, rotating positions in a pattern that made Class A's location a variable rather than a fixed point. Cecila's shots arrived where Class A had been. Class A was no longer where they had been. He did this 3 times across 60 seconds of desperate movement toward the domain's exit gate. It cost him mana he did not have cleanly to spare, and by the time they crossed through the gate and the demonic realm's air hit them, he was running on the frayed edge of his actual reserves rather than the borrowed residue. They came through the gate and stopped. The transition from the domain's artificial flatness to the demonic realm's weighted air was jarring in the specific way of coming in from very cold to very warm, an immediate, total sensory renegotiation. Class A stood on the other side and breathed. Behind them, the gate sealed itself in the standard post-use protocol. Ahead of them was the path back to Seitan Academy, and the assessment that waited there, and the question of what the instructor corps would make of what had happened. Wu Hyan counted the class. Everyone who had gone in had come out. Some of them in conditions that were going to require significant recovery time. Samuel, specifically, was going to require a reclassification of what recovery meant and what form it could take, given his current circumstances. But everyone was out. He had not been certain that was possible. He was, in a way that surprised him slightly, glad to be wrong about that. The walk back to Seitan Academy took 2 hours, and Class A covered it mostly in silence. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, the silence of people who had too much, and were waiting for a context in which saying it would make sense. The injured were supported by the less injured. The ones who were still processing what they had seen kept their eyes on the path and their thoughts somewhere further away. Samuel said nothing from Wu Hyan's hand, which was itself a communication of something, given that Samuel's default register was commentary. Wu Hyan walked at the rear of the group and watched them. He had written characters like these: young, capable, fundamentally altered by an experience they had not been equipped for, and he had always written the aftermath as a transition point, the moment before the story moved to its next stage. Standing inside the aftermath, he found it had a texture that the summary form had never captured. The particular way exhaustion altered posture. The small, involuntary gestures of people reassuring themselves that their bodies were still working. He noted this and said nothing. The academy gates received them without ceremony, which was how Seitan received everything. A gate officer logged their arrival time, confirmed the class composition against the roster, and directed them to the medical facility for mandatory post-mission assessment. The process was administrative and quick. The facility treated what needed treating and documented the rest. Samuel's case created a pause in the documentation process that lasted about 40 seconds, while the attending instructor looked at the horn on Wu Hyan's hand, looked at the mission roster entry for Samuel, and worked through the implications of what he was looking at. He made a notation. He moved on. Seitan's medical staff had apparently been trained to accept a wide range of outcomes as within normal operational parameters. Wu Hyan respected that. The evaluation session was held 2 days later, in one of the facility's review rooms, a space designed for exactly this purpose, with a projection surface for the recording badges and enough seating for the instructor panel that had been assembled to review Class A's results. Recording badges were standard issue for all midterm operations, small mana charge tokens worn at the collarbone that captured the wearer's direct sensory field throughout an engagement. The footage was not cinematic. It was raw and immediate and specific, and it captured things that after-action verbal reports frequently edited, not through dishonesty but through the natural human tendency to organize experience into sequences that made retrospective sense. The footage did not organize. It simply showed. Wu Hyan sat in the room while the panel worked through the recordings, and he watched the panel watch the footage, which was its own kind of information. Idea kept her expression neutral throughout, which meant she was reacting to something. Robolt, who had been included as Class A's magic theory instructor, leaned forward twice. Once when Besaha's shields came down, once when the borrowed power transformation registered in Wu Hyan's mana signature as a spike that the badge's sensors had apparently not been calibrated to handle, producing a brief burst of visual static before the recording restabilized. Ares sat at the end of the panel and said nothing for 40 minutes. When the footage concluded, the panel conferred. The conference was not long. Saitan's evaluation framework was functional rather than deliberative, designed to produce assessments quickly and with minimal subjective contamination. They were not here to discuss whether Class A had performed well. They were here to assess at what level Class A had performed and what that level implied for subsequent placement and resource allocation. The head of the panel, a senior administrator Wu Hyan had seen twice in the facility's corridors, and whose name he had to retrieve from several layers of his author's memory, stated that Class A had encountered an unexpected instructor-level combatant and had extracted with full personnel retention and successful completion of the operational objective. He said that the designation for this outcome on Saitan's evaluation scale was exceptional. He said the word without particular emphasis, the way a person states a factual classification. On Saitan's scale, exceptional did not mean what it meant in ordinary speech. It meant the next tier of resource access, additional operational authority for the class representative, and a priority placement in the midterm rankings that would affect the year's final evaluations. The panel filed out. Idea paused at the door and looked at Wu Hyan for a moment. She did not say anything. The look communicated what she would have said if she had been the kind of instructor who said things directly, which she was not, and Wu Hyan received it as she had intended. Ares was the last to leave. He stopped at Wu Hyan's position near the back of the room and stood there for a moment. He was a large man and the room was not large, and the combination produced a quality of presence that most people found difficult to hold their ground against. Wu Hyan held his ground. Ares said he had not understood what he was looking at when Class A returned through the gate. He said the footage had provided clarification. He said that clarification had required him to revise a number of assessments he had made over the preceding weeks, and that this kind of revision was not something he enjoyed, but he did it when the evidence required it. He said that leadership during an engagement where the expected mission parameters collapsed entirely, resulting in full extraction of all personnel including severely injured members, represented a quality of operational judgment that he had seen in instructors and not often in students. He paused. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said that what he had done in their sparring sessions, the constrained engagements, the calibrated pressure tests designed to probe for weaknesses, had been appropriate for the student he thought Wu Hyan was. He said it was not appropriate for the student he apparently was, and that if Wu Hyan had interests in the area of formal swordsmanship development, he was prepared to treat that as a different conversation than the ones they had previously had. He extended his hand, not in a formal gesture, in the practiced way of a soldier acknowledging another soldier, a specific motion with a specific meaning that operated outside the student-instructor framework they had been working in. Wu Hyan took it. Ares left without additional comment. The door closed behind him with the particular sound of a resolution, and Wu Hyan stood in the empty review room with the borrowed light from the projection surface still on, and thought about the specific strangeness of having just received a truce from a man he had designed to be a skeptic. He had written Ares as someone who came around eventually. He had not written the specific texture of it, the discomfort Ares had with the revision, the effort it took to say what he said directly, the fact that the handshake was how he chose to express it because he was not a man who led with words. The story's note had said, Ares acknowledges Adele and delivers truce. The actual moment had been different in a way that no summary could have captured. He was beginning to understand that this was true of most things here. The midterm results were posted on the third day following the evaluation sessions, in the standard format. A ranked list by overall score, incorporating the written assessments, the practical evaluations, and the operational performance rating. The list was public within the student body, which at Saitan served a functional purpose. It established hierarchy openly, removed ambiguity about relative standing, and gave everyone in the institution a clear map of where they were in relation to everyone else. Laurel Fran placed first. This was not a surprise to Wu Hyan, who had written it, but it was a surprise to most of Class A, because Laurel was not the student who projected the most obvious dominance. She was small and dressed with a precision that read as vanity before it read as anything else, and she had a particular way of addressing people, students, instructors, staff, that communicated, in very efficient terms, that she was operating several levels above them and was choosing to condescend to communication only because it served her current purposes. She excelled in support and buff magic, the category that most combat-focused students undervalued because it did not read as power in the immediate visible sense. What it was, in practice, was the ability to make every other practitioner in a group significantly more effective simultaneously, which in operational terms was more decisive than what any single offensive practitioner could produce. Laurel had placed first by doing what she was best at so well that the evaluation metrics could not credibly put her anywhere else. She received the ranking announcement with the expression of someone who had already calculated this outcome and was mildly disappointed that the institution had taken this long to arrive at the obvious conclusion. Wu Hyan placed fourth. He reviewed the ranking and worked out where the points had distributed and where they had not. Besaha was worth significant operational credit. The extraction under fire was worth more. The mana spike registered by the recording badge, the borrowed power transformation, had been classified by the evaluation panel as an unverified anomaly rather than a scored capability, which was a classification he was content with, because verified would have required explanation. The gap between fourth and first was real. He was not going to close it by the end of the year if Laurel performed consistently. And Laurel performed consistently. That was the specific threat she represented. Not her combat capability, but her reliability. He noted this, and moved it to the category of problems that required long-term solutions. The ranking had consequences beyond the abstract hierarchy. The top-ranked students from the midterms received priority access to Saitan's resources in the second half of the year, which in practical terms meant the secret weapon vault. The armory's second opening was scheduled for the week following results, and the entry order was determined by rank, which meant Laurel Fran entered first. Wu Hyan had expected this. He had prepared for it, had spent the days between the evaluation and the results cataloging what he remembered of the vault's contents and what he most needed from the second visit. The necklace was his primary target. He had left it the first time because he hadn't yet worked out what a god sacrifice meant in operational terms, and he had spent the intervening weeks turning the question over. He had not resolved it exactly, but he had moved from not knowing to knowing that he would not know until he was further into the year, which was a different condition and a better one. There were other items he had noted on the first visit. A cultivation supplement in the vault's sealed cabinet that interacted with chaos mana in a way that most practitioners couldn't activate. A set of inscribed bones in the eastern section that he had initially classified as decorative and had subsequently revised to functional based on 2 passages in the decoded sections of Robolt's ancient tome. A sealed container in the corner whose contents he still had not identified. He would have to work quickly. The vault visit had a time limit, and with Laurel entering first, the items that read as most obviously valuable would be gone before he reached them. This was fine. He was not looking for obviously valuable. The vault's second opening was held on a morning that was cold in the specific way the demonic realm was cold. Not weather exactly, but a property of the air, a density that pressed differently than human-side cold. Class A's top-ranked students assembled at the vault entrance in order, Laurel at the front, already reviewing some internal checklist. Balton, the Envy heir, built like a siege engine and operating with the direct confidence of someone who had never had a reason not to. 2 places back. Luna, who had placed in the top tier largely on the strength of her healing magic's evaluation, standing quietly near the end of the line with her hands folded and her eyes slightly down in the posture she adopted when she was alert, but not advertising it. Wu Hyan was near the back of the ordered group by ranking. He was aware of this and had already worked out how it was useful. Then Ares arrived. He came from the direction of the instructor corridor, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had somewhere specific to be, and he stopped at the entrance to the vault where the entry roster was posted and looked at it. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who had made a decision and was reviewing whether the decision still held. He reversed the order. He did not explain why. He said that the entry sequence had been adjusted, that the adjusted order was now in effect, and that this was not an administrative error. The senior administrator who had run the evaluation panel looked at Aries with the expression of someone who wanted to object and was calculating the value of the objection against the cost of the confrontation, and concluded the calculation unfavorably. Laurel Fran looked at Aries with an expression that was the most human Wu Hyan had seen on her face, which was to say she looked genuinely surprised, which was to say she looked for half a second like someone who had not accounted for this. Wu Hyan was now first. He stood at the front of the line and looked at the vault door, and he understood what Aries had done and what it meant. That the reversed order was the handshake continued, an extension of the truce into a territory that had material stakes. That the swordsmanship instructor who had spent weeks testing and doubting him had just used whatever institutional authority he could bring to bear to put Wu Hyan at the front of a line he had been placed at the back of by every metric the academy used. He did not allow himself to stand there and absorb this for longer than 2 seconds, because Laurel was behind him, and Laurel did not experience setbacks. She processed them and moved to solutions, and the solution she was currently moving toward would involve recovering whatever advantage she could from the adjusted order as quickly as possible. He stepped forward. The vault door opened at his approach, responding to the mana key he had been issued on the first visit. The staircase below was the same, carved, close, old in a way that persisted in the stone. He went down. The vault received him the way it had the first time, the diffuse sourceless light, the organized arrangement of artifacts without labels, the specific quality of silence in a room full of dormant power. He moved through it with the efficiency of someone who had prepared a route, who knew exactly where he was going and what he was taking. The cultivation supplement first. It was in the sealed cabinet, and he had to use chaos mana to negotiate the seal, a process that took approximately 30 seconds and which left the cabinet's locking mechanism slightly warmer than it had been. He pocketed the supplement without activating it. The inscribed bones were where he had noted them, in the eastern section, in a presentation box that read as decorative until you looked at the inscriptions with the specific attentional register that Chaos Affinity produced, not seeing the physical marks but reading the mana impression underneath them. He took 3. Left 2, because the 2 he left were complementary to the 3 he was taking in a way that made taking all 5 less useful than it appeared. The sealed container in the corner took him longer. He circled it twice, reading its exterior mana impression with the Eye of Superbia and the Chaos Attunement working in parallel, and what he got was inconclusive in a way that was itself informative. Inconclusive meant the contents were either shielded past his current reading ability, or they were something that resisted categorical identification. And in this vault, in this world, items that resisted categorical identification were the ones worth understanding. He did not open it. He noted its properties in sufficient detail that he could write them out afterward, and he left it for the visit when he had more tools to bring to the reading. The necklace was last. It was still on the low shelf near the back, exactly where he had left it, unmoved and unlabeled, as unremarkable looking as it had been on the first visit. He crouched in front of it and looked at it for a moment without touching it. A god as sacrifice. The god of pride had marked him. The connection between these two facts had not clarified in the months since the first vault visit, but it had compounded. He had learned more about the mark's properties, more about what the god of pride's acknowledgement meant in practical terms, more about the necklace's origin from the decoded sections of Robolt's tome. The pieces were present. He could see the shape of the mechanism. What he could not yet see was the consequence. What activating this artifact would produce. What it would cost beyond the activation price. What the second and third order effects of having it active would be. He picked it up. The cord was the same temperature as the air, which was strange for a physical object that had been sitting in a room. Objects in contact with surfaces took on the surface's temperature, and this one had not. He turned it over. The clasp moved in the direction that was not physically intuitive, the same as before. He put it around his neck. Not to activate it, the activation required the god, and that transaction was not something he was conducting in a vault with a line of students waiting above him. He put it on because the first step in understanding something was making it part of your inventory, and because he had left it twice now, and leaving it a third time felt like a decision made from fear rather than strategy. He held the weight of it for a moment, there in the diffuse light of the vault. The necklace settled against his sternum and was still. Above him he could hear, or perhaps feel, through the stone, the particular quality of Laurel Fran's impatience, which was not loud, but which had a texture that transmitted through materials. Behind her, the rest of the top-ranked students waiting in a reversed order that none of them had expected. He stood. He took a breath. He looked at the vault one more time, this space he had built on the page years ago in a world where none of this was real, this inventory of power and history and dormant consequence that had been waiting, in some sense, for the person who made it. He went up the stairs. The light at the top was colder than the vault's light, and the line of students waiting was exactly as he had left it. Laurel at the front now, composed, her surprise from Aries' reversal already processed and filed, her attention already on the vault entrance and what it would yield her when it was her turn. Balton with his arms crossed, Luna with her hands folded, the others in their various states of readiness. Aries stood to the side, not watching the line, not watching Wu Hyan, watching the middle distance with the expression of a man who had done what he had decided to do and was not second-guessing it. Wu Hyan walked past the line without looking at it. He walked past Aries, and as he passed, he registered the slight shift in the instructor's posture. Not acknowledgement exactly. Something quieter. The recognition that passed between people who have reached an understanding without naming it. He kept walking. Behind him, the vault door opened for Laurel, and the line began to move. Somewhere ahead, the second half of the year was waiting. The decoded sections of Robolt's tome that they had not yet reached. The necklace against his sternum with its unnamed demand. The reckoning the original Adele's reflection had accepted in exchange for 20% of a dead man's power. Kyle, out in the human empire, gathering information through a contract written in mana and maintained by a kind of pressure that Wu Hyan had not felt proud of applying. Renee, who was not at the academy, who was at her father's estate preparing to join him at the end of the semester. He had not thought of her in the specific way he found himself thinking of her now, which was with the awareness of an absence rather than an abstraction. The ring was in her possession. The ring's meaning was something neither of them had resolved. He walked back through Saitan's corridors with the necklace settled against his chest, and 3 artifacts in his pockets, and a borrowed debt whose terms he still didn't know, and he thought about the story he had written, and how much of it he had gotten right, and how much he had simply failed to understand from the outside. He had known the events. He had not known what the events felt like to be inside. He had known that Adele's story was tragic and stacked and unfair, and he had known that as a creative decision, and it had seemed like good storytelling from the outside. From the inside, it was different. From the inside, it was people. He turned the corner toward the cultivation wing, where he would spend the evening working through the supplement's properties and notating the inscribed bones, and then, because it was an evening, and he had learned that evenings required something other than operation if he was going to continue functioning, he would sit for a while, with the paper in his hands, and not write anything on it. Just sit with it, the way you sit with something you don't fully understand yet but have decided to stay with. The corridor was empty ahead of him, the vault was behind him. Saitan Academy continued in all directions, full of its specific and relentless life. And somewhere beneath the Academy's routines, the second half of the year was already in motion, already accumulating toward things he had written and things he had not, toward payoffs and reckonings and the particular irreversibility of a world that had decided to be real. He walked into it.